Hello, everybody. This is a very special episode of the Free Speech Forward podcast. If you've been following along, you know we started a special sub-series all in celebration of the Declaration of Independence and America's upcoming 250th birthday anniversary. But Chris and I wanted to hop on and do a special conversation to talk through the significance of the fact that we're marking this monumental anniversary with a declaration, the Declaration of Independence, and what that actually means for free speech. Because, well, it's not necessarily obvious that that would have to be the beginning of the country. I, for example, was even just looking up some other potential dates that we might have considered for when we might want to mark the birth of a new nation. It's not exactly like the birth of a baby, where instant that the organism is out of the womb and the umbilical cord is cut, you could say there's a birth. Because we theoretically could have started in 1775, the first shots that were fired at Lexington and Concord. John Adams, this might be an apocryphal story, but apparently thought that the date would have been July 2nd of 1776 because that was the date that the Declaration was voted upon. So that was the date it became official procedurally, but it wasn't yet released as a declaration yet out into the world until July 4th. We might have picked 1781 for the Articles of Confederation or the end of the war, the Battle of Yorktown. We could have picked 1783 when the Treaty of Paris was finally signed and Britain actually acknowledged that we were our very own country. Because before that, if you would ask anybody in Britain, we were just, a bunch of rebels who weren't following the crown as we should have been. We could have picked 1787, which is when the Constitution was signed, or 1789 when Washington became president. A lot of times now we think about marking things with the passage of the different presidents. So perhaps any one of those could have been a date to mark the beginning of the country. But yet we, I think, collectively had decided that the Declaration is the right date. And I think, Chris, you and I want to argue that it actually is the best date to pick for the birth of the country, and this is something significant for free speech. Any thoughts you want to share to get started?
Absolutely. No, thank you for that intro. And I'm really excited to kind of offer our own thoughts about that. And in honor of the theme, I'm wearing a little bit of patriotic colors here, red, white, and blue,
And some holiday colors too, because we're still wrapping
and
up the
some holiday.
holidays.
Exactly. But no, I think this is, it's frankly a question that I never really even thought about consciously until we started to prepare our thoughts around this. And as you just, I think, rightly ran through the timeline of events, there are so many different dates that you could finger America's founding on and around. I mean, there's so even going back to the initial settlement, there's just so many dates you could put it around. It's very, like so many things about America, it is truly unique in its founding. But as we're going to talk through tonight, I think this really was the most significant moment. And there's a reason why I think we chose it as the date that we still build our founding around 250 years later. It's interesting to me as I was contemplating the question itself, why the signing, or rather the signing and then the declaration of independence. I think that the gap you mentioned about July 2nd versus July 4th is that July 2nd was when it was all signed, but the Continental Congress, I think it was the Second Continental Congress, didn't actually adopt it until July 4th. So that was kind of like the date when it was formally released to the world once
And
that
it wasn't
once
announced to the world, and that's significant. So interestingly, if they had had our technology, we probably would all be celebrating on July 2nd because somebody would have been there with a smartphone, capturing what was happening in the room. But given the technology of communication and global communication and the procedure at the time, it ends up being July 4th.
correct. And as I thought about it, I realized that it's interesting how America collectively kind of united around that date and this milestone moment as the right date. And yet I sometimes wonder if it was kind of unconsciously so, because it's not something anyone ever talks about. It's certainly nothing I ever learned about, or even was passed down, heard about from anybody talking ever about the Declaration. I mean, I think Americans instinctively knew then and know even still now that that Declaration of Independence from the Crown of England was a significant milestone. But I often wonder, since we've reflected on this question, whether people really stop to think about why. And so I think that's what we wanted to talk about tonight. And as I analyze that question myself, I kind of had a few reasons to me why I think this is the correct milestone to order America's founding around. The first one being that, because as we mentioned, the colonists were coming from England and other parts of Europe for religious freedom and escape from authoritarianism abroad since the late 16th century. And so, in theory, people have been there and kind of quasi free and independent since they got here, because there wasn't, it's kind of informal ruling regimes of the time, or, at least kind of the countries they came from ruling from afar, and kind of lightly, if you will. So to me, part of the significance is in the years preceding July 4th, 1776, and the adoption of the Declaration. That's when you really had the culmination of the colonists' loose coalition forming into a formal community, saying we're going to create a nation, a kind of community bound by certain values, norms, and institutions, and build a culture and government around that. So I think that is one of the first significances the Declaration really marks. Yes, there was a Continental Congress, the first one that was formed in 1774, and you could argue that was the beginning of it, but that fell apart, and then it took a second one, and then ultimately the Declaration was how we kind of collectively said, all right, this time we're doing it, and we're coming together to form our own independent community. So I think that is significant. It was also a culmination, I think, of the entire Enlightenment project of English, French, American writings building up to and now exploding into real action and implementation of the Enlightenment ideals in real life. If you figure that going back to John Locke and many other writers of his ilk who were writing about liberty and individual rights and building kind of the canon of what we now call classical liberal thought, much of which shaped English law and government and culture leading up to it. And then you had the colonists doing the same. You had Thomas Paine writing Common Sense, came out earlier in that year. All of this was building towards then this declaration, which is still to this day considered, I think, one of the most significant statements in classical liberal thought. And in many ways, it kind of contains the foundation of American philosophical rationale and justification. And to that point, it also is kind of a full statement of purpose and values or philosophy that underpin the colony's alignment and the drawing of the boundaries of what we would and wouldn't tolerate. It laid out the rationale for rejecting England's claims of legitimacy and rule, and it was a formal declaration of war to really commence the Revolutionary War formally from the rebels' perspective. So just even as a statement of purpose and resolve and action, and then philosophy, the immortal words with which it opens and which still kind of are the North Star for the American founding, that is another reason why this was such a critical milestone and probably the most important one. And to that last point, it was an act as well as a statement, one which propelled the colonies forward and set the course of events to follow. And that statement and values contained within it, I believe, the moral support and fuel and clarity for everyone to fight on for I guess, what was it, almost 8 years going forward until we secured full independence. So to me, it also to me, and I think also why kind of collectively we chose it, is because it really provided and demonstrated the power of ideas when put into practice and action.
I think that last point is so crucial. And one that's going to be important as we're thinking about the significance of speech and why free speech is so important, and the Declaration as an act of speech. That when you are speaking, you are dealing with words, you're dealing with concepts, you're dealing with, in this case, an instance of political theory, but it's not just theory. By the very action of writing this and making that declaration to the world, to your point, you're planting a flag firmly in the ground, and you are, staking your position, and you are making a decided act. And certainly Britain and the rest of the world were then on notice to take note of what it is that we are acting upon. So I would agree with all that. And then just point out the significance, the symbolic significance of making the point of independence, that we are our own nation. Because previous to this, perhaps even some of the rebels who were fighting were still considering themselves British or English citizens who were perhaps just trying to reform the existing colonial law. But this makes it very clear, and I think this is going to get to the point of why speech is so significant. Because here we're making a very clear statement that this is not just a group of colonies that's trying to reform the existing colonial law. We are making an act of declaring our independence and declaring that to the other global powers to now recognize us as another global power. Of course, we were a tiny global power back then, unlike now, but still just to enter the world stage from that positioning and using language to make clear what our identity would be.
Wonderfully put. Yeah, and then I think that's a key point because um, it, you know it it's through language that we communicate these ideas, and I think that gets into kind of even the second part of our question, which is what is the significance of the Declaration today, 250 years forward? What can we take from this? And how does it relate to free speech, the purpose of our podcast here? And I would say, that kind of to tie back to that last point that we're riffing off of, just the mere fact that America began with an act of free speech just is so amazing to me. I think it shows how foundational speech is to freedom and to this country, and why, therefore, it was included in the First Amendment and is still so sacred to all of us, no matter our political leanings or, for the most part, philosophical values and foundations. So I just think that the fact that our founding milestone moment that we build our birthday around was an act of free speech, I think just shows the prime importance of that value. And also that speech is an act. It is not just words. The mere act of verbalizing your thoughts, whether through the written word, through speaking aloud, through other forms of communication, that is an act. And I think it speaks to a lot of what we've talked about in this series and in our separate work on our Substack about how, kind of human beings are beings of both body and mind, of thought and action. And I think the fact that America's first act was an act of speech, and an act of speech and declaring independence through our speech and our written word is also significant. I think also the Declaration and the significance we build around it as our founding moment demonstrates that speech takes place and manifests across multiple forums. Speech, written word, thoughts, kind of. And then they wrote pamphlets. They spread it far and wide through publishing and printing, and then public forums, town halls, etc. So that I think is significant as well. And the fact that the Declaration is, I kind of view, when you think about the Declaration and the Constitution as kind of America's two foundational or core documents, I kind of think of the Declaration like America's vision and mission statement, our North Star, if you will, our statement of fundamental values and philosophy, whereas the Constitution is kind of the business plan, the Articles of Incorporation, and the standard operating procedures, which, kind of borrows from the entrepreneurial business analogy, but I think is actually appropriate here, because I think another significant part is that America through the Declaration was the ultimate act of creating something new, a purposeful new organization, and a new experiment. In this case, in government and community coalitions. So I also think it's the power of philosophy and ideas and the need to put them into practice, the power and import of making your values and ideas clear and explicit, as the founders did in the Declaration and as we do in our statement on philosophical liberalism. So, those are just some thoughts I had as to why I think it is still significant now and how it relates to free speech. And I'll pause there, Joia, to see if you have any thoughts, and then maybe I even had some additional thoughts about our work on 1776 forward.
I love the entrepreneurial angle that you're bringing up here. The founders as the entrepreneurs of our country, and I think that is a beautiful analogy to think about what it was that they were doing and why, again, why the Declaration is the significant document and the significant moment, and why it is July 4th and not just July 2nd when everybody voted, but July 4th when really the world got the message, when that word spread to everyone. And again, I think this just reiterates what it is that language is doing for us in the best sense. That language is making this identification, and here it's even seeing what our identity is, and it's through using the tools of our language to make those identifications and then to spread that communication, that those actions are what create something magnificent like what this country has become.
Put, yeah, and I would also add that I think, in reflecting on why it has endured, I would argue that it's because the ideas contained within that vision and mission statement are fundamentally good. They're in accord with human nature at our best. And for any of you who have read our statement on philosophical liberalism, which is all about the philosophy of freedom for human nature at our best, that I think there's key ideas and truths and ideals contained within and identified within that declaration that are fundamentally correct and good and in accord with human nature, that is explains a lot of why it has endured for 250 years. We think it's interesting, as I reflect on the significance of this birthday this year. On the one hand, we think about America being kind of the new world and certainly much younger as a civilization than many others around the world, especially in the East, both in Europe and then even further east in the Middle East and China and India and the like. But on the other hand, in terms of modern governments in the year 2025 as they exist, the American government is fundamentally the same as it's been for 250 years, which makes it among the longest enduring governments of the same structure. And so I think that speaks to the significance of and the power of fundamentally good ideas that are in accord with human nature at our best, and why America has endured longer than many other countries that were similarly founded in revolutions of various forms, but whose revolutions were maybe premised on different ideas that weren't as clear or as liberal and kind of as in accord with human nature at our best as the American Declaration is. And that, I think, is something worthy um, of admiration and reverence in just what was achieved. But I also think, and it also explains why we even named our organization 1776 forward, and also kind of anchored it around this significant date, but then added the word forward, because I think we also recognize that as timeless as those ideals that were named within the Declaration are, they are also very timely in the sense that they constantly call us to live up to them at our best. And in many ways throughout our history, we haven't. And even today, in many ways, we aren't living up to them fully. And yet we can always return to that document. The clarity and simplicity within it, I think, helps us all kind of keep clear and return to kind of first principles, as we like to say here. And to use the entrepreneurial kind of analogy or refer back to it, businesses themselves, they either grow and evolve, or they ultimately die out. And I think, while I'm not advocating for constant experimentation and changing, I think there is something in that entrepreneurial spirit that the Declaration is written with, that contains within it, I think, the energy to constantly renew and experiment in new ways to better live up to the ideals that it lays out. And as Jefferson even wrote, or all of the founders who helped draft it wrote, whenever a government uh, you know whenever a government is deemed to be overstepping its bounds, the people have an innate natural right to change the form of government. So there is, even within the document, the roadmap for how we can return back to its fundamental ideals. So I think that also reflects that kind of entrepreneurial spirit, and one that we can continually refer to and take inspiration from.
That definitely ties into my thoughts of how I think we can even take this as inspiration for the year and moving forward. I've been thinking that in honor of the Declaration of Independence this year, that for me, this is the year for declarations. And I've been thinking about what is it that I want to declare. To your point, what are the timeless principles that I want to put a stake in the ground for and announce to the world and say, this is what matters. Let me give you some clarity on my identity, who I want to be, how I want to show up in the world, and to make that statement, to take that act and make that statement. So it's one of my projects for this year.
Can't wait to hear it, and I'm inspired hearing it, to take up kind of my own version as well. So, and I think that's a great idea for everyone. Kind of take inspiration in this monumental milestone year, a quarter of a millennia. It's just magnificent that we've made it this far. That we all kind of do our own form of our own Declaration of Independence, and our values, and and really study the meaning and significance of what was achieved 250 years ago, and how we can apply those ideals and expand upon them as we go forward to preserve it. I read a piece just today, um, that was also reflecting on the 250th anniversary, and it talked about just how do we remember something like a country's founding, and how should we think about it, a birthday, an anniversary, things like that. And I think the main message that it took away from is to kind of reflect on both the achievements of the past and all the work that still remains to be achieved in the present to live up to those ideals. And that it is, we inherited them. Everyone alive today had no role in creating America, but we inherit this great gift, and it's incumbent upon us to live up to those ideals if we're to preserve it for the next generations.
And to carry the torch forward to make another connection with our organization and our logo there.
Absolutely. And that's certainly what we're doing. And I'm just really excited and proud that we are here in this moment doing this work, and contributing our small piece to this wonderful effort, so that 250 years forward from now, at the half millennium point, people are what is it, successors will be in a similar position, and be in a much freer position than we are today.
That's certainly our goal, 1776 forward.
Absolutely. Happy birthday, America.
Happy birthday.